economic development. So thank you, Pak Peter, and this forum for you here. Thank you.
Baiklah, good morning. Terima kasih Bu. Dan memang merupakan kehormatan. It's a pleasure for me to come to LPAM guna membicarakan keadaan tentang perekonomian Indonesia about the Indonesian economic situation. Now, this is a discussion that has a number of aspects. One aspect is economic history. The economic history of Indonesia for 50 years. Another aspect is international economic cooperation between Indonesia and the international community. The reference for this discussion is a book which was just launched 2 days ago. Ada peluncuran. There was a launch of the book in the Ministry of Finance by the President of the Asian Development Bank. The new president, the Asian Development Bank, has a new president, Asakawa, and it was also launched on the Indonesian side by the Deputy Minister, Pak Swahasil Nazara. So this is the book. It is not yet on the web. It will soon be on the web. We will announce it, and I will get Bu Lydia. Terima kasih Bu Lydia for organizing this. I will get Bu Lydia to circulate information. It is a knowledge product for the ADB. Now this book has several aspects. Yang pertama, the first aspect is that it discusses kegiatan ADB, the activities of the Asian Development Bank, which is a sort of cousin of the World Bank, for 50 years in Indonesia. But it is not possible to discuss the work of the ADB without discussing the work of the broader community. Bank Dunia, perusahaan Jepang, Jerman, Amerika Serikat, and other countries. So the broader community and the interaction between Indonesia and the broader community. And it is not possible to discuss this community without discussing the overall environment in Indonesia. So there are 3 stories. Story number 1 is about the work of the ADB. Story number 2 is about the environment that the ADB was in. And story number 3 is about perkembangan di Indonesia selama 50 tahun. So it's about these 3 different stories. Now this is the outline of what I would like to discuss today. First, I'll give a little bit about the latar belakang, the background. Second, I'll just give you a ringkasan, a quick ringkasan. Melihat ke depan, looking forward. Just the main conclusions that I will come to. The main conclusions are mengejutkan, a little bit startling. So I'll give the main conclusions. Then there will be the main discussion. Ini bab ketiga, bagian ketiga. 50 years of development cooperation. Some beginnings in the overall data. Kita membutuhkan informasi kan supaya evidence based. So we need some facts, kenyataan, fakta-fakta. And then some discussions. And then overall, keseluruhan. Lantas, yang keempat, I will again discuss the kesimpulan, lebih mendetail. Lantas akhirnya, yang menjadi pertanyaan, which becomes a question is, well, with this 50 years, bagaimana masa depan? Bagaimana in the next 10 years? Kita kemana? Quo vadis? Where are we going? So this is the ringkasan. Now, ini yang pertama, background, bab ke-1. Bagian ke-1, background ini. Ini sedikit tentang background of perkembangan IT as in Asia and some tantangan in Indonesia. Now this is a graph. It's not so clear. It is a graph of the whole dari tahun 1900. It starts at this is a graph of the whole of the 20th century. And it is the living standards, and the axis is a log scale. And for the first 50 years, there are the countries. There is data for China, India, Indonesia, and Japan. Jepang kurang jelas, Jepang yang paling atas, maaf ya di sini kurang jelas, itu kurang jelas. Tapi yang jelas ialah the three main developing countries for 50 years more or less had constant standards of living. We could say that income per capita in Indonesia, India and the PRC almost did not change for 50 years. And in fact, tidak ada data di sini, tapi untuk 500 tahun, 1000 tahun sebelumnya, mungkin there is no increase in income per capita in these three big countries in Asia. And then we can see that in the middle of the last century, round about the middle of the last century, tahun 1950 atau 60, about the middle of the last century, something amazing happened. This is a real change of history. Here comes Asia. Asia begins to grow, and we can see that there is a very historic change, and we can see that the standards of living in the three big countries begin to rise. Already it's not very clear on the graph, I'm sorry to say, but in Japan it's a good deal higher, and Japan was growing quickly for a long time and then flattened out. But we can see another thing that is very surprising, and this is important for us who work in Indonesia. Sebelumnya ya, pada tahun 1920, 30, 40, standar kehidupan, the standard of living in China was below the standard of living in Indonesia. Actually, standard of living in Indonesia was lebih tinggi secara rata-rata than in China and in India. So this is actually a very big question for us who work on Indonesia. And then we can see that China began to grow. Look at China, it's paling bawah, it's the bottom, and China begins to grow, and it begins to grow, and it begins to grow, and it catches up to Indonesia. For a long time, selama tahun 70, 80 sampai 90, the standard of living in Indonesia was higher than the standard in Indonesia was higher than in China. And then there was the Malapetaka Asian crisis. We can see they crossed over at the Asian crisis. And China kept growing, and Indonesia has slowed down. So this is the background. This is the background of the last 100 years or more. And so a key question for all of us is what are the factors yang mendorong laju pertumbuhan, standards of living and so on in Indonesia. Now, throughout this period, there was kerja mulai pada akhir tahun 60-an, we will come to this, but at the end of the 60s, there was cooperation between the pemerintah Indonesia, the Indonesian government, and the masyarakat internasional, international community. So we will come to that, and I think menurut saya, barangkali kamu setuju, barangkali tidak, maybe you agree with me, maybe you don't, but I think this international cooperation for 50 years was very useful, I think, both for Indonesia and for masyarakat internasional. There was good cooperation between Indonesia and masyarakat internasional. It was good cooperation, and I will come to that. Now this is the second aspect which I want to discuss. And menurut saya ini penting sekali. Kolom yang paling penting ialah kolom yang paling kanan, total investment. Ini merupakan yang menjadi pertanyaan. This is an interesting question for me. We must think about jumlah modal per capita for each country. Total amount of capital. What do I mean by total amount of capital? I mean physical capital, I mean human capital, I mean other capital. Pertambangan, for example, mining and so on. Di negara saya, my country, Australia, we have a lot of capital which is pertambangan. And for some countries, they have a lot of capital which is laut. They have a lot of resources. So there are four types of capital here. Yang paling kiri ya, there is produced capital yang diciptakan, seperti jalan, seperti sekolah, seperti perumahan. If you look out of the window at the back of our room here, you can see some perumahan which are going up. These are yang produced capital. Yang kedua ialah natural capital, misalnya pertambangan. Indonesia has quite a lot of sektor minyak, sektor pertambangan. This is natural capital. So of course countries such as Arab Saudi, Saudi Arabia have a lot of natural capital. And then yang ketiga ialah modal manusia, human capital, what we have up here. Hopefully we have a lot of human capital in this room, yeah? I mean, mudah-mudahan. But, so this is human capital. Lantas yang keempat ialah foreign capital. Ada beberapa negara seperti Arab Saudi, seperti Brunei, which have a lot of savings luar negeri, financial capital luar negeri. Now, what is very interesting is this, the total amount of capital per orang, per person. Kalau kita melihat yang paling bawah, ya, there are three countries paling bawah, negara yang paling kaya di sini. It's Amerika Serikat, Jerman, and Japan. And we can see that in the United States, for example, jumlah modal, jumlah capital per orang mendekati, it becomes approximately close to 1 million. 1 juta, ini 983, ini dari tahun 2014, so it's 2014. It's round about 1 million, 1 juta dollar per orang in America. If you think of it as roads and schools and modal manusia and everything, this is a measure of the total amount of capital. In German, it's about 700, and in Japan, mendekati 600. Now, what is very interesting with this total amount of capital buat saya, capital is very important. Capital ada jalan, ada pembangkit listrik, saluran irigasi, dan lain sebagainya. And if we look at the total amount of capital in Asia, what is interesting, we can see Singapore, tinggi of course, not surprising that Singapore is high. Malaysia is quite high, 240. China is $100,000. In infrastructure and in everything else, termasuk modal manusia, termasuk sekolah, universitas dan lain sebagainya, is very, very important. And the gap, the jurang, the gap is still very large. So what this means, just to secara singkat ya, the pelajaran is very simple. We need to invest. This is a very simple pelajaran. And how much do we need to invest? We need to invest a lot. We need to invest and invest and invest. And it will be a very long time before we can close this jurang antara modal in Indonesia dan modal di negara yang lebih kaya seperti Jerman, malah Amerika Serikat. So this is, we talk, now why is this important? There's a pesan pokok here, pesan pokok saya ialah investment and capital accumulation is very important. Why is this important? Why it's important is that when we talk about laju pertumbuhan, when we look back at the previous graph, and we look at the laju pertumbuhan, we often wonder, what were the factors that promoted growth in the region? Now, of course, we often talk about perdagangan, we talk about pendidikan, we talk about good governance, dan lain sebagainya. We talk about all of those things. But pesan pokok saya is jangan lupa capital investment. Capital investment is very important, and there is still a huge jurang. Now, this is why, now I get to this is just by way of background. I want to talk about main conclusions. The main conclusions I have looked at kerjasama antara Indonesia dan masyarakat internasional selama 50 tahun, a long period of cooperation began in the tahun 70, 80, 90 dan lain sebagainya with the World Bank and the EMF, like with Japan, with America, with lots of other things. Looking at this long period, selama 50 tahun, what are our main conclusions? Here are my main conclusions. Now these main conclusions are rather berani, ya, maaf ya, saya cukup berani mengemukakan and putting forward some broad conclusions. First, the development cooperation program in Indonesia along this period from 1967 to tahun 2016, that's 50 tahun, was one of the largest sustained development cooperation programs in the world. It's very interesting. In this country, we have had an interesting example of one of the largest in the world. So it becomes an interesting question. Was it a success? And if it was a success, mengapa? Apakah ada pelajaran for other countries? Lantas yang kedua, kesimpulan saya, it was a success. Some people will say it wasn't a success. It wasn't a success sebab kamu mendukung Soeharto. Soeharto brengsek. Why do you call it a success if you support these things? Lantas ada malapetaka pada tahun 97-98, the Asian financial crisis. This whole period ini gagal ini if there's a financial crisis. Now saya tidak setuju. I think overall it was a success. Lantas ketiga, kesimpulan ketiga is there were several keys to success, and one of them, jangan kita lupa, one of them is peranan yang memainkan pemimpin Indonesia. The Indonesian side played a very important role. Jangan mengira bahwa World Bank menjadi dalam hal ini, IMF menjadi dalang. Indonesia played a very important role in this program. So these are my three kesimpulan. Now what about 50 years of development? We come to the main part of the story. The beginning of this period of development took place in 1966. There were key features at the time. The Indonesian economy it still faced very serious difficulties. You'll recall, I'm sure, this was just after the period of Bung Karno. Soeharto had just begun, and everything was rather kacau, everything was rather confused in Indonesia. But then the second thing was that there was the Perang Dingin. The Cold War was important at that time, and there were lots of concerns about keadaan di Asia Tenggara. And maybe we forget, but 50 tahun yang lalu, this was before ASEAN. Actually, at the time, in 1966, there was still conflict between Indonesia and Malaysia. So the situation in Southeast Asia then was very different to the situation now. And then yang ketiga, this was pada tahun 66, there was war coming in Vietnam. Belum full war, yeah? But by 70 we had bombing, there was a big war in Vietnam. So this was the suasana pada waktu itu. Now with this as a background, Western countries hesitantly agreed to support Indonesia in late 1966. In May 1968, there was an important development. The president of the World Bank, there was a new president of the World Bank, his name was McNamara. He had been Menteri Pertahanan, Sekretaris Pertahanan of Defense in America, the Secretary of Defense. McNamara, he was a very important person in the administration of LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson. And his kunjungan pertama, his first visit as president of Bank Dunia was to Indonesia. And he came to Indonesia and he said, kami dari Bank Dunia akan mendukung Indonesia. So this was a symbolic sign, and he called to the international community to support Indonesia, and they established a new group called IGI, Intergovernmental Group on Indonesia. It became a lembaga, which is quite well known, Intergovernmental Group on Indonesia. And so they mendirikan IGI. At first, ini agak kabur, orang tidak tahu apakah IGI akan bertahan atau tidak, akan sustainable atau tidak. It was hesitant at first. But after, the main goals of IGI were to support stability in Indonesia, to help with immediate short-term needs, and to promote long-term development. So these were the goals. And I put these goals here because later we will have to decide, were these goals achieved? We come back 50 years later and look back at these goals, were they achieved? The overall flows of Indonesia. What becomes an important question is, I'm talking about a period of 50 years, how big was this program? Now strangely enough, you know, we don't have much literature about this. This is a strange thing. It was a very big program, and we have lots and lots of individual reports, ribuan laporan tentang proyek ini atau proyek itu, tentang usulan ini dan usulan itu, but we have very few overall surveys. So here is the data. Again, it's not terribly clear yet, but let's take it. We can look at this is data from the OECD, Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. And the data is that we have data, two sets of data, yang paling atas ialah current prices, but current prices are the prices of each year, so it's better if we put them into constant prices for tahun 2016. But let's just look at current prices at first. At the very first stop, we can distinguish between gross flows and net flows. Gross flows are the total you get, and the net flows are the amount after repayment of money. So if you get a pinjaman, if you get a pinjaman from the bank to membeli rumah, the first payment you get maybe $100,000 or something like that. That is the gross flow. But akhirnya, 20 tahun later, you will have a negative gross flow because you will have paid your money back. So the gross flow is the total initial payments. Now the total initial payments for a period of 50 tahun were mendekati 245 billion, yaitu miliar Amerika Serikat. So 245 billion, this is gross flows over 50 years. Kalau secara neto, it came down to 88 billion netto. Now this is in current prices, in constant prices. Constant prices lebih berarti, I think, because constant prices means something now. The gross flows were 340 billion, and the net flows were 150 billion. Now, mengapa I have put several different figures here? Why I have put several different figures is that sometimes people want to argue about the figures. They say, wah ini kamu pakai angka ini, you've taken this figure, and angka itu tidak relevant. Saya lebih suka angka yang lain. I prefer some other figures. So I have tried to give you an overall picture. But the overall picture, the most important, for me, the most important overall figure on this table is ke bawah itu gross flows. The gross flows over 50 years from the international community were roughly 340 billion United States dollars. Now this is a very big program. It's a very big program, and it is one of the largest programs of sustained financial flows. Now don't forget, this is pemerintah flows. It's not sektor swasta, and it's not foreign direct investment. This is official flows. Ini uang dari pemerintah dan melalui Bank Dunia dan lembaga multilateral. It is official flows to Indonesia for 50 years, and it is one of the largest flows in the world. So it's a very important figure. Yang menjadi pertanyaan for us is, did it succeed? Was it successful? Dipergunakan untuk apa? What was it used for? All of this money, if you get a lot of money, what is it used for? Is it used for anything that is any good? Atau pemborosan aja? So it becomes an important, and $340 billion, it is not a small amount, yeah? We have to know what it was used for. So now, what is also interesting is that amount as a proportion of GDP. Because you can say, yes, well, those figures don't mean anything to me. What does it mean as a proportion of GDP? Well, here it is as a proportion of GDP, and let me see, it's, I better just show, this is kurang lebih 5. The middle of the graph is 5%, so at the beginning of the period, total flows were about 5%. They rose sharply pada akhir tahun 60-an, at the beginning of 1970, 71. Then they began to fall off a little bit, and then they rose again. Now I'll talk about, I just give a little story about each of these, because I have in the book, and if you get the final publication, there are several periods. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, you can see the different periods. Now in the first period ke-1, there were high flows in the early 70s. This was the beginning of the early 70s. There was the Revolusi Hijau, the Green Revolution in Indonesia. There were programs of Keluarga Berencana. There was a lot of investment in irrigation. So this was after the first Repelita ke-1, and the international community supported Repelita ke-1. But then, the next period, then something happened in Indonesia. There were two boom minyak, there were two oil booms. So with the price of oil going up, some people in the international community said, well, maybe Indonesia doesn't need so much support anymore. With all of this oil money coming in, so you can see that the amount of support fell for a while. Now then it rose again, because there was the boom minyak pertama, the first oil boom, and the second oil boom. The second oil boom was in 79 and 80, and then the oil boom fell away. So the international community came back and began to support Indonesia again. This is the third period. So during the 1980s, and the Menteri Keuangan was Ali Wardhana. We are here today in the Ali Wardhana room, and this was Pak Ali Wardhana's period. There was Pak Harto was the president, and there was Pak Widjojo Nitisastro, and there was Pak Ali Wardhana. And you will recall that group, the Berkeley Mafia. The Berkeley Mafia termasuk Widjojo and termasuk Professor Muhammad Sadli. I see there's a Gedung Sadli quite close by. So we are in the area of the Berkeley Mafia here. And the Berkeley Mafia period, this was the period ketiga. So international support came back again, because Ali Wardhana and Widjojo and so on said, we will masuk a period of reformasi, reform of the Indonesian economy. So then the support rose, and then later during the 90s, this is the fourth period, during the 90s there was quite a lot of private foreign investment in Indonesia. There was a boom of capital coming in, and it seemed that Indonesia did not need it so much anymore. So you can see that aid the support began to fall again in the 90s. And then, period lima here, in the fifth period, there was the Malapetaka of 97, 98. In the Asian financial crisis, there was a sharp jump. The international community came in and supported Indonesia during the period of the Asian financial crisis. Now, since that time, there has been a tendency for foreign aid and for international cooperation flows to reduce. In period number 6, this was just after the Asian financial crisis. There was a lot of concern in Indonesia about the international debt, and so Indonesia didn't want to borrow so much. And then most recently, there has been talk in Indonesia about graduation sebagai aid donor. So these are the periods, this is the history. Here are the ADB, saya dari ADB ya, and I just want to show you the ADB through this period. For a long period, the ADB increased its support. Then the ADB, like everybody else, fell back some support in the 1990s. In the Asian financial crisis, the ADB gave strong support again, and more recently, it has fallen off. So this is the performance of the ADB. Now, what about this flow of money per negara, by negara? I give some data of this, and this data I think is a little bit too small to read, but roughly 2/3 is what we call bilateral support from DAC, development assistance countries, and yang paling penting ialah Japan, and then the others are multilateral. Here is a gambar, maybe it's easier to see on a gambar. These are the total flows, this is the total amount of support, 33 from Japan. So through this long period there has been a lot of support from Japan. And that is why people like Pak Widjojo Nitisastro always had quite a good relationship with Japan. The United States gave quite a lot of support pada awal, at the beginning, but after the United States did not give so much support. United States support was strongest at the beginning. You can see that there were the other countries. German gave quite a lot, Prancis, for a while it was Negeri Belanda, so a number of those countries gave support. You can see the World Bank gave almost 20%, and the ADB gave around 10%. Now with the ADB, of course, ADB 10%, ADB ada hubungan yang erat dengan Jepang. So with Japan and the ADB mendekati, well, it's more than 40%, yeah? So you can see that the Asian link here the link between Indonesia and Asian partners has been quite strong. This is the overall picture, and this gives the background of Indonesia's international cooperation for along 50 years. So what did we do? What happened with all of this? Some details of the program. Well, here I give a sort of ringkasan of the history. There was first the recovery period in the late 60s, and the ADB provided soft loans. Now, one part of this story, we will see if we go into more details, we will see that over the period, the way the Kerjasama, program Kerjasama between Lembaga Internasional and Indonesia changed. It changed to reflect kebutuhan di Indonesia. It changed to reflect the Indonesian situation. So at first, Indonesia needed a lot of immediate support, especially in agriculture. Then there was the first oil boom, and the ADB shifted its form of lending to what was called blended lending. Some of it was pinjaman lunak, some of it was pinjaman yang dengan syarat yang lebih strict lending. Then there were high oil flows with the period of the boom minyak bersatu, and then in the 1980s there were sharp falls in the oil prices. And after the sharp falls in the oil prices fell, I showed you the graph before, donors began to come back again and to give more support. And the ADB itself softened the terms of assistance. It gave pinjaman yang lebih lunak. Now, during the 1980s and into the 1990s, there was successful economic liberalization. So ADB began to shift in the Bank Dunia, they all began to shift towards programs of cooperation in other sectors, sometimes with pinjaman which are not so soft, because they didn't have a lot of soft money, so the soft money went to negara seperti Bangladesh, Pakistan and other countries. Then there was the Asian financial crisis. Well, this was really a malapetaka. Nobody expected the Asian financial crisis. So when the Asian financial crisis came, the program of Kerjasama, the international program of cooperation between Indonesia and the international community, really had to change gear. There was a very sharp change. The traditional forms of assistance were no longer relevant. Sebab keadaan sangat mendesak, yeah? It was an urgent situation. If during the 1970s they invested in schools and they invested in power plants or irrigation, this was not needed in the middle of the Asian financial crisis. So there were different forms of cooperation, and the international community changed gear and did other things. So the international community was flexible atas permohonan from the pemerintah Indonesia, from the requests from the Indonesian side. Now then after that, however, one of the consequences of the Asian financial crisis was a sharp increase in debt of Indonesia. And I remember my friend Pak Budiono, who was the Minister of Finance at the time, was very, very concerned about the high level of debt. And so for a time, Indonesia became rather reluctant to borrow. So we began to move into a period of where Indonesia, and it was keputusan Indonesia, it was Indonesia's decision to cut back the amounts of lending. But then there was a global financial crisis in tahun 2007-2008, the global financial crisis. And there was tekanan, there were pressures on Indonesia from international markets. And so Indonesia, although Indonesia did not want to increase its debt, it did need liquidity assistance. And so during this period, this third period, there was not so much loans, pinjaman for projects, but there were pinjaman for liquidity assistance to improve Indonesia's functioning in international markets, to bolster, to strengthen Indonesia's credibility. So again, this is a different approach. And then finally, most recently, there have been, since then, there has been uncertainty in international markets because of the keadaan belum tentu in Europa. And most recently, we have been moving towards upper income status. Now, of course, just now in the last month or so, minggu yang lalu, minggu ini ada tantangan baru, ya, and this is the Corona crisis. So we will coronavirus. We will have to see whether there is any international cooperation in the area of the coronavirus. Now this is a sort of ringkasan, and here's another. I'll just give the ring. This is another ringkasan. At first, there were what did the international agencies do? What were their actual kegiatan? Well, during the 1970s, there was an emphasis on projects. There were thousands of individual projects, ribuan projects all around the country of many kinds. They were supported by the international community, and there were things like irrigation, green revolution in rice, family planning, keluarga berencana, transport, power, so there were, and later in education and health and so on. So many individual projects. But during the 80s and 90s, there was a broadening of the type of assistance. People began to start saying projects alone are not enough. So we moved into a new period when there was emphasis on broader programs by sector and what was called program lending. So particularly the World Bank and the ADB had to change the things they did. And then over time, during the 80s and 90s, there were changes in international thinking about development. This became particularly important after the fall of the Berlin Wall. There was the end of the Perang Dingin, the end of the ancaman communisme. And so in 1990, 91, 92, there was a big change. Now I think it's my impression that perhaps people don't understand the change that this led to development thinking. But before tahun 91, before 91, there was a lot of concern about communism and the Perang Dingin, and after that, the development community changed. And so there were many more, you could say that the agenda of development became much wider. We all began to become much more hijau. We began to talk much more about the environment. We began to talk much more about gender. We began to talk about financial inclusion and about NGOs, LSMs, and so on. So the agenda widened, and then so during the 1990s, development cooperation programs in Indonesia focused on these factors. First, supporting Indonesia's own emphasis on structural reform, because Indonesia still wanted, and there was a lot of talk at that time, ini point ketiga tentang pro-market. Everybody becomes pro-market. There was President Reagan in America Serikat, there was Thatcher in Inggris, and it became a sort of demam kebijakan. Everyone is in favor of the market. And we had a lot of market investments in the sektor listrik di Indonesia, yang akhirnya gagal. So there was the pro-market investment, and then there was yang ketiga, the widening attention here, especially from selected donor countries in Europe, to social and governance issues. Then there were a series of events. 97, 98, there was the Malapetaka Asian financial crisis. So international programs were adjusted. The international community actually found it hard to adjust to this. Mereka shocked them. They were not ready, belum siap. They didn't know what to do to help Indonesia, how to help Indonesia. Indonesia too had to adopt a new strategy very quickly. And of course there was a new president, Habibie, and then Gus Dur. So the situation was really quite confused. So this became a difficult period for Indonesia. There were three presidents, Habibie, Gus Dur, and Ibu Mega, and it was a difficult period for Indonesia because the situation was economically unstable and politically uncertain as well. So when there's instability like that, it is difficult for the international community to work as well because they don't know who to work with. You know, maaf ya, but I mean, Gus Dur was not so easy sometimes to work with if you are the Bank Dunia. And there was Pak Menteri Pak Wickiangi, not so easy. They are critical of the international community. So there's tekanan, there are clashes. And then since then, there have been several events. There's the Asian tsunami, and then the more difficult global situation. And then, as well as this, there's the rise of new donors. Ada periode baru, terutama dari China, yeah? So the environment is changing. In 2007, the consultative group on Indonesia, there was first IGI, Intergovernmental Group on Indonesia. IGI menjadi CGI, Consultative Group on Indonesia. So IGI was abolished. by SBY. SBY said tidak dibutuhkan lagi. Then there was 2008-2009 response to the crisis. In 2009 there was something called the Jakarta Commitment, which was a new relationship between Indonesia and donors. And then, as I said before, sejak itu tahun 2010 sampai 2015, there are continuing uncertainties in financial markets. And then, most recently, Indonesia has established a South-South cooperation program. So overall, standing back, what do we make of all of this? There are many kegiatan, many specific activities. But for me, there were three things that stand out over this whole period. Yang pertama, through this whole period, there was support for capital accumulation. And as I said before, capital accumulation is very important. Capital accumulation secara average support from international community through that period was 2% of GDP. If we have an ICOR, an incremental capital output ratio of 2% of GDP mendukung 5% per tahun of laju pertumbuhan. Now, since that has fallen away, the laju pertumbuhan of Indonesia has fallen away as well. So there has been a loss of 2% of international capital flows, secara rata-rata. Now, I think this is rather interesting that Indonesia sebagai negara yang masih sedang berkembang, Indonesia needs capital. And we have to think about whether Indonesia should still be importing capital. And there is a big debate here. There are many people in Indonesia, I know, yang meragukan apakah whether it's good for Indonesia to borrow or not. But for me, Indonesia still needs capital. Lantas yang kedua, what the international community did throughout this long period was support effective policies. Now, it's a bit difficult to measure this. This is rather vague to measure it. But the international community supported good macro and supported good micro. Dua-duanya. And I don't think we should push this aside. I think we should remember that the support for good macro and good micro was an important component of decision making throughout this long period. And then yang ketiga, a third thing that if we look at the history of cooperation, we can see that during this period the international community was very flexible. It responded to kebutuhan Indonesia and what Indonesia wanted. Pak Widjojo, Pak Ali Wardhana, sampai sekarang Ibu Sri Mulyani, you can coba bayangkan ya, Ibu Sri Mulyani, she tells the World Bank what she wants. I was with her the other day. She met the new president of the ADB, President Asakawa. Sri Mulyani told him what she wants. You can imagine, Sri Mulyani, she will tell them. So the pemimpin of Indonesia, the economic managers of Indonesia are cukup berani and cukup tegas, mewakili Indonesia. And when they represent Indonesia's wishes, there is rapid and flexible response from the international community. So these for me are the three overall things that the international community with Indonesia did during this period. Yaitu investment, support for policies, and third, flexible responses to particular crises. There was the crisis of 97-98, there was the crisis of the Asian tsunami, there was the international crisis of 2008, 2009, and since then there have been some problems in markets, and the international community has helped. So these are valuable things. In addition, di samping itu saya ingin mengutamakan bahwa salah satu ciri khas, an important factor of the ADB is that the ADB supports regionalism, mendukung ASEAN dan supports Indonesian support for regionalism in Southeast Asia, which for me is quite important, and Indonesia plays an important role. Main conclusions. I said there were three main conclusions before, and here they are. You've seen them, you saw them before. I state them again. The development cooperation program in Indonesia has been one of the largest sustained programs in the world. It was remarkable both in size and scope, and it's supported by supporting Indonesia for 50 years. It has actually supported a transformation in Southeast Asia. If you think of Southeast Asia today and you think of Southeast Asia 50 years ago, there has been a transformation in this region. ASEAN has been important, Indonesia has played an important role, and international support for stability and growth in the region has been important. So this is one key factor. A second key factor, saya menarik kesimpulan, I draw the conclusion, now this is a bit vague, yeah, but my conclusion is was it a success? I think clearly it was a success for me. Of course there were projects that failed. Of course there were sometimes programs that did not succeed. But overall, it was a success. Just because something fails here or something fails there does not mean an overall program fails. In universities, there are students who fail. Does that mean the university is not a success? Of course not. And of course, there are perkawinan which fail. Not every marriage is successful, but people still keep getting married, even though some of them fail. So just because we can point to failures here and there, we'll say, proyek ini gagal, ini tidak merupakan sukses. This does not prove that the overall has failed. Lantas yang ketiga, there were several factors behind the success, and bagi saya, one main factor was strong and effective leadership from the Indonesian side. So don't just say IMF atau Bank Dunia menjadi dalang controls Indonesia. Itu tidak benar. Indonesia, the leaders of Indonesia have been quite successful. You know, even Suharto was very clever in the way he took part in this program. Mengapa? Because dia tidak campur tangan. There was not political involvement. He left it to Widjojo. He left it to Ali Wardhana. This was actually very clever. His big contribution was not to campur tangan. If you go to other countries, you have pemimpin, Trump, yeah? You have Trump, atau in the Philippines, Duterte, mereka campur tangan. And this actually often leads to failures in programs. So whenever you think of Suharto, one of his big contributions was not to campur tangan. Then looking ahead, well, I think this will only take 1 minute. Looking ahead, we now have, hari ini, we have some questions. Looking back over 50 tahun, we have some questions looking ahead. What will Indonesia's relations be with donor partners, both traditional and new? Are the new partners, kan? Terutama China. There are new partners and Arab Saudi and so on during the 2020s. Number two, what programs of development cooperation will Indonesia itself? Indonesia has a South-South program, talking about a South-South program. What does Indonesia want to do? And lantas yang ketiga, what official borrowing programs will Indonesia enter into? Will Indonesia continue to borrow from luar negeri? Remember, these are official borrowings, not foreign direct investment or not portfolio flows. We are talking here about official investments from overseas. What will Indonesia's official borrowing programs be in the development cooperation area? With whom? And what will be useful? Okay, cukup, sudah cukup. Indonesia and the international community selama 50 tahun. Sudah cukup. Terima kasih ya. Tuh.
So we are open. Thank you, Professor Peter. So we are open here for question and answer. Is there any questions? Yeah.
Saya tadi tertarik dengan penjelasan Bapak mengenai kita masih terus membutuhkan investment and capital accumulation. And then you said that we need, say like the relationship with other countries. First, my question, what do you think the best countries, because now we are making relationship with China with the base reason that China not connect all the investment mostly come from private companies, not from the government. So it means it's very contradiction with your opinion. So what do you think? Because I think the government now thinking that we choose China, many investment, offering investment, the government rejected, say like Japan, yeah, and then choose China because China, the investment comes from private companies, not from the government. You said that countries government flows. So, what country do you think the best for Indonesia now, if the loan comes from? And then why you think that private loan it's not better than government loans? And then the second, that you said every 2% of investment can support 0.5 growth rate, yeah, of GDP. So it means if we talk in here, many politicians always thinking about how to increase GDP. It's very easy, but they never talks about this, yeah, the investment. So I think it means if you said every 2% of the investment can make increase 0.5 growth rate of GDP. So it means if we want to increase 5% of GDP, okay? So it means we need 20% of investment. As analogically we are saying. Yeah, I think.
Okay, thank you, Ibu. Well, your first question was about who to borrow from or who to get money from, and also what to use it for. From one point of view, conceptually, if we think about it, really the issue of investment from overseas, in one way it is simple. We should always look for good money, hopefully with low rates of interest and without conditions that are too tight. And we should use the money well. So tangan kiri and tangan kanan. You have to think of both sides. Where does the money come from and what do we use it for? Just on that second one, what do we use it for? Of course, it can be wasted. So we have to be very careful. Maybe you still recall in tahun 74, 75, 74, 75, we had the problem of Pertamina. Ibnu Sutowo, the president director of Pertamina, borrowed from overseas and he really just wasted it, and it led to a crisis at the time. So it is always true that we need to think of both sides. Where does the money come from and how do we use it? Now, we should only borrow if we can use it well. So we have to have a good list of things to use it well for, and that's hard. It's true, it is hard. You know, it is easy to spend money. It is not so easy to spend it well. So we have to spend money well. So this is certainly a big challenge for the Indonesian government to have areas, sectors, where the money is well spent. But let us assume for a moment, I am an economist and we make assumptions. Let us assume we have good projects. There is then the question of financing. Where does how to get the money? And that too is quite a challenge. In fact, I just have a book here. It was written, edited antara lain by Bambang Susantono. He is actually a wapres at the ADB from Indonesia. He's an orang insinyur from EDB, and it's about infrastructure financing in Asia. And it's difficult. You can make a mess of borrowing. So the answer is hati-hati. Look at each one. Maybe some from Japan, maybe some from China, maybe from some Arab Saudi. Some of it will be in the form of they will offer funds for misalnya the train to Bandung. We can look at that. Others sometimes Indonesia will ambil initiative, take the initiative and borrow. PLN has issued bonds, so that's borrowing. So there are many forms of borrowing. You know, you go into a rumah makan and you have a menu. Well, you've got a menu of borrowing too. And you have to peel, if you go into a restaurant, you choose your meal carefully. Or you have to choose your borrowing carefully as well. So choosing the finance and choosing the projects, this is actually not so easy. And it is easy to get it wrong. So I think sometimes there are policymakers in Indonesia, seperti Pak Budiono. Pak Budiono is a friend of mine. Pak Budiono is rather cautious. He has a reputation of being careful. And I understand. I understand why he's cautious. It is easy to waste it. So the answer really, Ibu, and this is not it's not a simple answer, but the answer is look at the borrowings carefully, look at them one by one, and then look at where the money will be used for, one by one, and try to make sure there is a good matching. It's almost like a perkawinan, yeah? You're a family, you're arranging a marriage, you have to try to make sure that it cocok. Maybe it doesn't cocok. Or maybe it cocok for satu dua tahun. So it's difficult to make the fit. But we do need to make the fit. So when, for example, let's just take a specific example. Pak Jokowi was looking at the investment for the train to Bandung. He had offers from China, and he had offers from Japan. And he looked at them carefully. Well, that was right. It was the right thing to do, to look at it, and to weigh them up. Now, any China, any Japan, to weigh them up and to think about them. And I think at the end he has chosen to use money from Japan for the train to Bandung, and I think if I'm not mistaken, they are talking about using money for Bandung from Japan for the train to Surabaya. Well, now I think all of this is good. It is the right thing to do, but secara realistis, if we are realistic, not all of it will succeed. There will be some failures. And if we look at experience from overseas, investment in infrastructure is hard. That's a lesson from overseas. You can look at quite a lot of large projects overseas, and to get everything right, financing, engineering, economics, thinking about the demand for it, environment, very difficult to get it all right. But we must try. It's important to try, because I was looking at these figures before. You saw these figures before. Where are they? Ini mogok ini. Can we go? Well, we'll go back in a minute. I mean, I'm thinking about the Indonesia's need for where is it? Yeah, this one. The need for capital. Level of capital in Indonesia is cuma that's kurang lebih 50,000 per orang, about 50,000 per person, banding 1 juta in America. Indonesia still needs a lot of investment, so we must try. And sometimes we will get it wrong. It is true. Sometimes we will get it wrong. Now that's the answer to your first question. The answer to the second one was really, what I was saying before was really a little rough. Saya mengakui, I want to confess, to talk about an incremental capital output ratio and so on is a little bit rough. But just step back for a moment. You're right, you mentioned for a 5% rate of growth in Indonesia with an ICOR, incremental capital output ratio, it needs an investment level of 20%. Well, in fact, level of invest overall level of investment at present is around about 30%. Overall, this is not just what I have been talking about here. I'm talking about all investment in Indonesia is around a little bit more than 30%. Malah in China, it's 50%. They have a very high level of investment. Probably too high. But with a level of investment in Indonesia of 30% and an ICOR of 4, Indonesia should be getting 7.5% growth. Now, for various reasons, it's tidak jadi, for various reasons. So we don't get a perfect fit with these figures. These figures are rather kasar, they're a bit rough. But it's useful to bear them in mind. And certainly if we look worldwide, there is a close relationship between level of investment and rate of growth. Certainly one very main lesson is if we want a country to grow, harus ada investasi. So what I'm really saying is, for a long time, Indonesia was getting an additional 2%. Now, of course, not all of it was used for investment, but that additional 2% with an ICOR of 4 actually helps the rate of growth. I don't know if it is exactly 0.5, but it helps the rate of growth. And it is interesting that since that graph before, since the level of investment has fallen, it's fallen, international cooperation has fallen, the rate of growth has fallen as well. It's interesting. We just need to think about that. Ada hubungan. That's it.
Indonesia is realizing that they can no longer rely on international development cooperation investments, so they're also trying to build regulatory reforms around investments, especially in the omnibus bill recently. But that has been very controversial, whether it's needed or whether it's the right strategy for us. So we have thoughts on that as well.
On what's the second step? Indonesia has been trying to do what?
Indonesia has been trying to maybe rely less on international development cooperation investments and trying to invite more private investments, maybe through the omnibus bill, for example. So is that the right strategy now moving forward? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Those are two good questions. Terima kasih. For me, I think maybe it is. Maybe it is right that there is something of a change in the relationship between Indonesia and the international community, because the level of cooperation, the financial flows have been going down, and Indonesia is becoming stronger, having more confidence. In fact, that was happening during the 90s, but then there was the shock. Indonesia was beginning to get more confident selama periode 90-an, but then it was hit with the Asian financial crisis. So it makes sense. Indonesia is the third largest developing country in the world. We have China, India, Indonesia. So it makes sense that Indonesia builds its own really international economic cooperation program. In a way, what we are talking about here is economic diplomacy. And we are really talking about one aspect of Indonesia's international economic diplomacy. So it makes sense for Indonesia to think a bit more about its international economic diplomacy. But having said that, I don't think this means the end of economic cooperation. I think it means a change. I think I would say that, look, all countries benefit from good international economic cooperation. And it can be both ways at the same time. Just as any country, we have exports and imports. We don't just have exports and we don't just have imports, we have both. So Indonesia, with its economic diplomacy, can be on one stage working with the World Bank and the ADB, and it can be having programs in Indonesia, and at the same time Indonesia can be having programs overseas. There is no reason why Indonesia should not do both. Related to this is a very important idea. The word is openness. There was a report from the World Bank around about 2008. It was produced by the Commission on Growth, and it was about growth. Pak Wardhana was a member of the Commission on Growth, and the single most important message was that for a country to grow, it is important to be open. So economic diplomacy is part of openness. So that is why I had those last questions I had. These are really for you, for kamu, orang Indonesia, berpikir tentang ini. What will Indonesia's relations with development partners be? Now, I think it is important that Indonesia thinks about these, and for there to be good relationships, Indonesia needs to formulate good policies in a document, in a statement or a document. Needs to put them out, and Indonesia can do this. I've seen Indonesia has done this before, and it needs to think about the second question as well. Indonesia, your president Pak Jokowi came to my country 2-3 minggu yang lalu, 3 weeks ago, and Pak Jokowi talked. He said that Australia and Indonesia should be development partners in the Pacific, he said. So this relates to question number 2. So in short, I think that Indonesia should continue to do it. I don't think Indonesia should cut all of this off. And Indonesia should aim to have it both ways, should have still active programs of international cooperation, but also active as well. And there are examples of you being active. Ibu Sri Mulyani became Managing Director of the Bank Dunia, and Ibu Mari Pangestu became Managing Director most recently. Now, the second question was, I forget, the second question was?
Inviting the private sector investments, especially through regulatory reforms such as the Omnibus Bill.
Right, yes. Okay, what I want to say about that is Indonesia needs both. It needs both private sector investments, but it does need official levels of investments. And may I just say one other thing, this is quite important. There is a lot of talk, when we talk about infrastructure, there is a lot of talk about how we must ikut sertakan, involve private investment. Well, hati-hati ya. I mean, the truth of the matter is, if we look at much infrastructure throughout the whole world, the great bulk of investment in infrastructure is in the public sector. In fact, this is one lesson that comes out of this book. Until 90% of investment around the world in infrastructure is in the public sector. It is going to be very hard to get private sector money into infrastructure. This is a sort of, maaf ya, I'm sorry, yeah, it's a sort of impian. It's very hard. And we have private sector investment in Australia, and I can tell you, our pengalaman is that it is not easy. Because these are very different, public and private, very different. And often there are disagreements. So for people to just say, there's a kekurangan uang dari pemerintah, harus ada uang dari sektor swasta. There is no harus about it. Jangan membicarakan harus. You know, it might not happen. It's very hard. But we should try. We should try, but we should be realistic and know that it will be hard. That's it. Kasih.
So much. We meet again, Pak Simon dari Canberra. If I have some question, the first one is infrastructure investment actually in public, so private sector might not want to cut. And the second one is actually following the question before about Indonesia already start to graduate from the lower middle income and want to be with upper middle income. And one indicator is government of Indonesia now is trying to become OECD member, and OECD member, and because of that, Indonesia still wants to be placed in more countries that more developed. But what you mentioned before that we still lack of capital accumulation on investment, something like that. So it's contradictory. So yeah, following that question again, I just want to get some better, like what do you think about that? Like how we actually place ourselves in this situation. And the last question is about CEPA, like Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. Actually, other economic cooperation is currently Indonesia doing is under the FTA, but we changed name into the CEPA, like with Australia we have CEPA, with EU and other countries, and we want to create some other form of cooperation with other countries. What do you think about that? Yeah, thank you.
Okay, on the first point about public and private and capital flows, you said that in some cases Indonesia has, you've invested, you've designed projects, you've identified projects, but you find it sometimes difficult to attract money. I think that's true. As I said before, it is difficult to get these two sides to work well together. And this book is about difficulties of it. The trouble really is that the groups who have large investment funds, for example, there are in Australia, there are large amounts of savings, and they want to invest. We have pension funds, quite large amounts of money. Canada has large amounts of money and they wish to invest. But they are very careful about, they want strict conditions. And often the channels, the saluran, the legal and financial channels are not clear or are not there. This is institutional failure. Sometimes the legal situation is kurang jelas. And so if there are investors overseas or investors dalam negeri who have $100 or $200 million or something, they will be very reluctant to invest in something for 10 or 20 years. It's a long time if there's a degree of risk. In fact, a lot of it is about risk. We really need to talk about risk. One key to all of this flow of investment is the level of risk and how to control risk. Investors who have money overseas, and there are large amounts of investors, and dalam negeri too. Investors are always thinking about risk. Takut akan hilang uang. I mean, even right now, international stock markets are falling as we sit here. Stock markets are falling because of the coronavirus. So markets go up and down. And if you are an investor overseas with a lot of money, pension funds, you have a lot of people who have saving, you have responsibility to your pension, you are very concerned about risk. Now the trouble is, and this book does make the point, but it is true, in many developing countries, including Indonesia, the level of risk is still quite high. People are concerned. There's legal risk, there's political risk. So in talking about these things, one of the things we need to think about in designing the regulatory regime we need to think very carefully about risk. That is a key word. So somehow, Indonesia can get a lot of money through FDI and portfolio investment, but it depends on risk. And that, by the way, this is slightly different. By the way, this is in some ways an advantage of kalau pinjam dari Bank Dunia atau dari ADB, some ways the risk is less because the two countries know each other very well and it is multilateral and it is government. So money from the World Bank and ADB is what I would call good money. Now there is other good money around from the private sector, but it is more difficult. Buktinya, I belong to a fund in Australia. I have a retirement fund and I contribute to the retirement fund. When I look at that fund puts some money into India, but it does not put any money into Indonesia. Now when I look at it, mengapa? Kenapa ya? Because there sudah ada saluran yang dapat dipercaya. There is a legal instrument, there are legal arrangements that they can channel the money to India, but they cannot channel the money to Indonesia because the arrangements do not exist. This is an institutional failure. And this is something which kebijakan Indonesia, policymakers could change this, but they need to think about it. Now look, yang kedua about the OECD, I think we were talking about just before the previous question, I think it's perhaps quite useful to become a member of the OECD, but also I think perhaps be careful, again hati-hati ya, because every time you join an organization it will take time. There are obligations. They will want reports, they will want data, they will want staff to attend to Paris. OECD is in Paris. Australia is a member of the OECD. Saya dulu sebagai wakil Australia. Saya harus ke Paris. Jauh dong. From Canberra, it's a long way to go to Paris. Begitu jauh for a meeting one day, satu hari, enggak mau saya. There's a big cost. So I think it's possible Indonesia should concentrate on ASEAN, should concentrate on the region. So don't be too ambitious, not too ambitious. Maybe a semi-member or something. At present, people from the OECD mengunjungi Indonesia. Maybe cukup ya. And then, sorry, the third question was?
SEPA.
Oh, IACF, these are the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreements. I think they're useful, Ibu, again, provided they don't take up too much time. But it is useful to have, they're a sort of alat. You know, when ministers meet, when a minister comes, minister mengunjungi datang dari Jepang ke Indonesia atau dari Australia ke Indonesia, from Indonesia ke luar negeri, they need something to talk about. And it is useful to have a SEPA to talk about. It becomes part of the agenda. It becomes something to focus on. But it will take time, that SEPA. Because at the end of the day, the SEPA is one thing, but implementasinya tidak mudah. Agreeing to the SEPA is easy, secara relatif ya, but implementasinya sulit. Cukup, Bu? Ya? Oh, terima kasih.
Selamat siang, Pak Gita. My name is Dino. I have two questions. Hopefully it's relevant to the topic we're discussing now. I want to know, is there any studies regarding the Indonesia's performance to pay its debt, to pay the loan, regardless if the interest or the main loan itself, and how does the international institution view from the performance? And the second one is, I think it's the term last year is pretty viral. Maybe we've heard of the Chinese money trap. It's affected the Bangladesh or Sri Lanka, if I'm not mistaken.
The which one, Pak?
Chinese money trap. Have you heard?
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. I think maybe Indonesia currently does not have much option. As you said, lower interest but with tighter terms and conditions. And I think it's just a game of influential power from the Chinese government. But what's the current like other countries, other developed countries trying to compete with the Chinese loan program? Thank you.
Okay, terima kasih. I used this graph before. I'm sorry it's not so clear, but in these figures, and maybe it's not so, it's broken down, it's a little bit hard to see, but I have, in each case I have dua garis. I have two lines, two small lines. One is called ODA, and the other is called OOF. Now ODA is Official Development Assistance, and it is basically grant money. Tidak ada hutang, there's no debt. So grant money is usually good money, although sometimes it comes with syarat. Actually, you know, in this world there is no such thing as free money. As Milton Friedman told us, there is no such thing as a free lunch. So there is no such thing as free money. But ODA does not cause a debt. So looking at the figures, we need to distinguish between ODA and what is called OOF. OOF has a debt. Now it's true that OOF, now within OOF is a zoo, it's a kebun binatang of money. Some of it is good money and easy money, some of it is a bit more difficult. I think money from the World Bank and ADB is basically good money. Some of the other money is export credits and it is tarikat. So you have to look at the money carefully. So in short, but to answer your question, you just have to examine the money. You have to look at it bit by bit. If you go to a bank, mau pinjam uang, you have to look at the syarat. Tingkat bunganya berapa, time period, are there any syarat? And you as a minjam, as a borrower, you have to make a choice. And Indonesia should do the same. Which gets me to my your second question. Sometimes Indonesia should just say no. Just say, terima kasih Pak, enggak mau. And Indonesia should do that. Sometimes I think Indonesia does it. And sometimes other countries do it. There was an example, this might be surprising. But 2 or 3 years ago, Myanmar said to China, China wanted to make a big investment in a bendungan, in a dam in northern Myanmar. There was a big fuss in Myanmar. And Myanmar said no. So, Indonesia tidak lemah dalam hal ini. Just say no. And I hope the Indonesian government does say no. If the conditions are not right, don't borrow. And just say to China, thank you very much China, it is very good of you, but this time, kali ini, we don't want to. Mungkin minggu depan, mungkin bulan depan, we will look at it again. But I think Indonesia, you can afford to be tough, tegas in this matter. And I hope you will be. Don't take, if the money does not suit, if the conditions of lending don't fit, or if the project is not a good project, don't do it. Just say no, politely, in a Javanese way. I mean, we have Javanese here. The Javanese can be, we don't have to do it like a Batak. We can do it in a Javanese way. But that's okay. That's what I recommend. Yep.
Thank you for all the questions. Thank you, Peter. Thank you again for joining us here in LPM. Hopefully, Peter, you can share again about Indonesian experience as well as international community. I hope that current strong leadership can continue also with strong institutions. Thank you.
Terima kasih.